Oh hi, I didn't see you there. My name is Bliss Foster. Welcome back to the Margiela series where we're exploring every single runway show that Martin Margiela produced at his eponymous house. We find ourselves in spring-summer 2003. Gosh, we're like really moving through this thing. This is crazy. We're all the way up to 2003. The show takes place at the National Theatre of Chaillot on a massive marble stairwell with mirrors on both sides. We've actually seen stairs as a runway once before for the Maison in spring-summer 1992 when it was in an abandoned train station. I think stairs end up being a really useful runway tool for Martin. We already know that he prefers for women to have their natural way of walking when they're on a runway show rather than a professional model walk. There were shows like Spring-Summer 1990 that forced the models to walk naturally because they were literally walking on dirt. Stairwells are kind of a similar idea to that in that they prevent you from being able to do the heavy foot slam and like heavy hip swaying that's required in order to do a professional model walk. If you're in heels especially, you have to walk kind of carefully on a stairwell, and that, again, will kind of bring out the natural characteristics of a person's walk. The few times in other runway shows where we've seen models, even for a moment, go up on stairs, we kind of see them break their normal model walk because they're like, oh shit, I don't want to trip. Hey, you want to do me a solid real quick and join the Patreon so you can watch the entire Martin Margiela episodes? You get exclusive episodes, you get to watch the live streams back, you get episodes early. It's so sick, you should join it. It starts at $3 a month and it takes 9 seconds to sign up. Go do that, please. Let's dive straight into the conceptual core of this season. All the models wore vintage shoes that the Maison bought from a flea market. So they got the shoes, put them on their feet, and then over the shoes they put on these lycra tights that are usually used for ballet. The Margiela team then rubbed chalk over the tights to emphasize the construction details of the shoe. It was chalk for the lightly colored ones, and then for the darker colored ones they would use tailoring chalk, which is white. So that made it where the original flea market shoes shone through in this very ghostly way. Okay, so this is when we get into some really wild stuff. We're gonna do a quick art history lesson. Do you know what frottage is? I didn't know what frottage was before I started researching for this episode. To quote the Tate Modern's definition of frottage, frottage is a surrealist and automatic method of creative production that involves creating a rubbing of a textured surface using a pencil or other drawing material. The surrealist artist Max Ernst was doing frottage in the 1920s to create stuff like this, and this, and this. He would take something that already existed naturally and then use the etching from that to be the foundation for a larger piece of art. If we're just thinking about this in a grade school art class kind of way, it's a pretty simple technique, right? You just get something like a leaf, you do a little like etching of it on a piece of paper, and then you're like, oh cool, I could turn that into like a tree. We'll do a couple of them, and then it's like a forest. Yay! Martin and the team would use the same technique to frottage the details of vintage shoes onto lycra tights that had been stretched over them. So basic stuff. Right? This is another example of a fashion designer using some kind of reference to the art world, and the connection between the two is shaky at best, right? Wrong! Frottage was one of the guiding principles of Surrealists, and the Surrealists were very principled artists. This was back at a time when art movements would have manifestos written for them. They would have guiding principles and goals that weren't just about the art itself, but about society and the human condition. And the Surrealists specifically put a lot of emphasis on the subconscious. OMG, is this episode still about Margiela? Yes it is, Chief. Hang tight, we're getting there. To quote the Museum of Modern Art, the Surrealists borrowed many of the same techniques to stimulate their writing and art, with the belief that the creativity that came from deep within a person's subconscious could be more powerful and authentic than any product of conscious thought. Okay, so the creativity of your subconscious brain is prioritized over the creativity of your conscious brain. Put a pin in that because we're going to come back to it. Over the course of human history, we have made things and we've been progressively getting better at making things. Technology is the easiest way to trace this. Like, for example, the light bulb did not just pop into existence. Humphrey Davy was the first person to figure out that we could make light using electricity. Warren de la Rue created the carbon filament light bulb, but it was way too expensive to manufacture. Joseph Swan managed to make the manufacturing much cheaper, but the light bulbs burned out way too quickly to make them practical or a product anyone would even want to buy. Then Edison swooped in, made a couple of adjustments to literally just a couple of pieces, and made it where it could both be mass manufactured cheaply and also burn long enough to make it a worthwhile product. And that doesn't even talk about the scores scores of other inventors all over the world that were working on similar improvements to the light bulb at the same time. Things don't just poof into existence suddenly. It is the product of generations of people looking at something and saying, oh, this is really interesting. I bet I can make this just slightly better. Okay, so it's not a one-to-one comparison, but the same general developments happen in art as well. There's a cultural swirl of influences that are constantly happening all around you, and all of those things affect you when it's time for you to make your life's art. Do you remember back in the episode for Spring Summer 1996? It's the one that I have with the thumbnail saying Margiela's finest moment. Martin and the team bought vintage clothes from a flea market, put them up against a wall, photographed them, then took the negatives of those photographs and used them to screen print the photographs of the vintage clothes onto the linings of new clothes. We're sort of carrying that same idea here, albeit in a really new and pretty badass kind of way. I'm gonna say some pretty wild shit here in a second. Please at least give me a second to explain myself before you just say fuck this and turn the video off. You ready? Fashion designers don't really design clothes. The designs for those clothes move through them. When you study fashion design, you're exposed to all the greats, right? You study all of the people that came before you. And when fashion designers actually begin their work, they're still going to fashion exhibitions, looking at old magazines, they're going to flea markets to look for inspiration for their new work. And then they design a collection, and all that the public sees is just this collection that poofed into existence, right? And it looks like that designer was just creating something that came from just inside of him in isolation. All of this looks like it's just happening in a vacuum, but fashion design doesn't happen in a vacuum any more than the light bulb happens in a vacuum. It is the product of a worldwide scope, massive, big clob of influences that are all coming together and then moving through you to make your work. And that's the thing that separates art from technology, is that technology is, in a very literal way, building on each other. Art does build on the influences of what came before you, but it happens in a much more subconscious way. There are, of course, conscious times where you're saying like, oh, this vintage jacket is very cool. Let's just remake this and make that part of the collection. But a lot of times those things just happen subconsciously. You've been exposed to your school uniform. You've been exposed to the clothes that your parents wore. And whether or not you realize it, those things are having some kind of effect on how you view those kinds of clothes. I mean, I've talked to thousands of you through Instagram DMs, and I've talked to a lot of, especially like younger kids who are designing their first collection, and they don't even realize what they've done, but they've basically recreated the work of Raf Simons and Peter de Potter. And there's no hate to that at all, especially for younger people. If they're just making something because they want to make something, go for it, recreate something, that's totally fine. But sometimes those kids don't even realize that they are literally recreating an aesthetic that Raf Simons all but owns. And it's just because it's moving through their subconscious. They've seen enough archive pages and just been around enough like cool fashion streetwear people that they just sort of have it implanted into their brain that like, oh, that's what's really cool. This like use of like images kind of cut and pasted onto hoodies and stuff. And Martin has always been really transparent about this. While most fashion designers hide beneath this veil of originality, Martin finds beautiful ways of showing his own influences, but more importantly, shedding light on the influences that are driving all of fashion forward: vintage clothing. And the execution here is so subtle that we almost miss it. By using frottage on the shoes, referencing back to the Surrealists, there's that emphasis on the subconscious mind. And that's what brings us to a lot of Martin's work, especially in this season. A lot of the conclusions that he comes to in his design work feel like that automatic process that the Surrealists so heavily depended on. Like, what if we made a few tailoring adjustments to a skirt, added in a hole in the front, and then we wore it like it's a long shirt dress? Instead of only making wearable accessories, what if we painted a literal shadow of the accessories onto the skin? Martin sees the world in a very different way, and it's almost like when he's moving through his day, there's nothing that's taken for granted. There's no automatic looking for him where it's just kind of like, oh yeah, that's just a curtain, that's just a table. It's like he's seeing everything and all of the possible recontextualizations that the thing could have. Because that would be exhausting, right? Seeing the world in that way. And so I wonder if he's just telling us that the secret to this is that you lean more into the automatic processes of the subconscious mind. This was a really beautiful season. I'm really looking forward to seeing if we get more information about like automatic processes in the subconscious mind in future seasons to kind of get more insight into the actual process of how these clothes were made. Don't forget to go join the Patreon. We still have a lot to cover in this season and just about every other season in this entire series. Go follow me on Instagram. I love everybody a whole bunch. I will talk to you next week. Bye.